Alrighty, thank you everybody for being here today. My name is Hunter Thompson and I'm going to give a presentation on homeless youth. So a little bit of an overview of what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about what homelessness is, the magnitude of the situation, primary causes of homelessness, its implications on youth, intervention, and then some conclusions and recommendations. So I want to start us off with a brief video of one student's first-hand account of dealing with homelessness.
Dante here.
It was 2012 and it was just me and my uncle and my grandma who were living in the house. I was walking down the hill and my mom was outside, and I remember she had already started crying, her eyes were red, and my grandma had just passed away. And like after that it kind of dropped. Like what happened was my uncle, he kind of kicked us out. It was barely like 4 days after, and he was basically like, you guys gotta go. It gets me mad talking about it, but it's terrible, but it's whatever. So we moved in with my mom's friend for a little while until we found a shelter. It was difficult, you know, when I lived in the shelter, I couldn't take showers in the morning, so, you know, I stunk a little. One thing my mom says I'm good at is coping. Like, that's one of the best things. Like, she says I can be sleeping on a hardwood floor and still not be complaining. As long as I have somewhere to sleep, right?
There are many reasons why people become homeless. Maybe the rent is too high, maybe you're LGBTQ and your parents don't approve so they kicked you out. Each situation is unique to the individual and where that person lives. But once students are homeless, it's really difficult to identify them because different federal agencies have different definitions of how to define who's homeless. HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, has a pretty simple definition. You're homeless if you're A, living in a shelter, or B, living on the street. The agency has almost $2 billion set aside to help the homeless. So if you're in either of those two categories, you're eligible for some of that money. In 2015, HUD counted over 560,000 homeless people.
So that just is a brief description, Dante's accounts of dealing with homelessness firsthand. Talk a little bit more about that shortly. So, what are some things that define homelessness? As the video said, HUD has one specific definition of homelessness, and that is either living in a shelter or living on the streets. A bunch of different agencies have different definitions, which kind of makes it difficult to narrow down criteria to identify the homeless. One definition that I found was children and youths who are sharing the housing of other persons due to loss of housing, economic hardship, or a similar reason. So that's kind of Dante's story right there. Living with his uncle and his grandma, she passed away and ended up getting kicked out. Next, children and youths who may be living in motels, hotels, trailer parks, shelters, or awaiting foster care placement. Another one that I found was children and youths who have a primary nighttime residence that is a public or private place not designed for or ordinarily used as a regular sleeping accommodation for human beings. And then one of the more prevalent ones that is seen and more easily able to identify is children and youths who are living in cars, parks, public spaces, abandoned buildings, substandard housing, bus or train stations, or similar settings. So condemned houses, living in the plaza downtown, I see it all the time here in Chico. A little bit about the magnitude of the situation. So for every 100 families that are seeking low-income housing, about 30 of those are actually able to be placed in low-income housing, so that leaves about 70% of families to be homeless. Nationally, between 1.6 and 2.1 million youth ages 12 to 24 are estimated to be homeless over the course of the year. So at any one given time, if you are homeless, even if it is for a couple days, you're added to that statistic as a youth. In California, it's estimated there are 200,000 homeless youth ages 12 to 17, so roughly middle school age children to high school age children. And then 33% of the nation's chronic homeless population lives in California. So can anybody give me anything that they think is a primary cause of homelessness? Yes.
Like becoming poor because you lose your job.
Yes, exactly. So poverty is one of the main reasons. I mean, if you don't have money for things, you can't pay for your rent. Unemployment during the recession, especially, a lot of people lost their jobs. There weren't a lot of jobs available. Homelessness kind of skyrocketed as a result. Low-paying jobs. People sometimes have to work 2 to 3 jobs just to make ends meet, and even then might not be able to. And then lastly is lack of affordable housing, especially in California with the housing market being so high. I remember living in San Francisco. A 2-bedroom apartment was $6,000 a month, and obviously that's, you know, the Bay Area, the higher end of the spectrum, but that just kind of gives perspective on how ridiculous the housing market can be. So we're going to move on to the implications on the youth, kind of the effects of homelessness on the youth. So first one would be children that are homeless, impoverished children, are more likely to have issues in regard to their health and deficits in education. So these children are sick a lot more often and missing out on educational opportunities. Lack of transportation. If parents aren't able to take their kids to school and they're not able to take the bus, can lead to chronic absenteeism, which can definitely affect academic performance. And then in regard to stress, neuroscientists have linked poverty in children to unhealthy levels of stress, obviously in excess of children in a higher socioeconomic status. Lack of clean clothes and sanitation can lead to bullying. As Dante said in the video earlier, he wasn't able to shower on a daily basis, so he began to stink. Children can be very cruel in that regard. At a young age, impairment of language skills and memory can make it difficult to escape the cyclical aspect of homelessness. And then finally, in regard to implications on youth, the risk of exposure to violence, racism, child abuse, etc. goes up pretty dramatically for homeless youth. Next, we're going to talk about some intervention, some things that we can do about it. The main thing to intervene in regard to homelessness is working on identifying homeless youth. You can't begin to help somebody until you've identified them as at risk and homeless. Another thing is certain states have different requirements for enrollment. For example, immunization. Certain states require all children to be immunized to be going to school. So it would be wise to train all staff, teachers, principals, what have you, on legal requirements for enrollment. To remedy the immunization factor of schooling, you could establish immunization databases and have school immunization clinics, little mobile units. Title I funds could also be used to assist youth in meeting their basic needs, food, clothing, stuff like that. And then working with local services, whether it be, you know, a local shelter or CPS if necessary, to get adequate accommodations for children. And then finally, some recommendations and conclusions. Overall, during my research, I found that homelessness is not a direct cause of academic and social deficit, but it is a pretty big contributing factor. In comparison to children of low socioeconomic status that aren't homeless, children that are homeless don't have any greater risk of academic deficit. But obviously those who are in a higher socioeconomic status have more opportunity. And a network of relationships is needed not only to identify homelessness, but overall support the individual in all aspects of their life. And then finally, the biggest recommendation and conclusion I have after doing some research on homelessness is to create an environment that is warm and understanding. I've talked to several teachers and counselors at different school sites, and oftentimes with chronic absenteeism, teachers tend to get pretty irritated easily and aren't as understanding of children. I think, you know, a big part of breaking the cycle of homelessness is to open up to kids and allow them to feel comfortable with expressing themselves and telling you that they are homeless so that they can get help. And that is my presentation. Thank you.